Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler. There are a few brands in this industry which I'm rather glad that I've been beside since the beginning, and one which I've developed a particular affinity for is Direnzo. The founder of this Swiss brand, aside from being a superb designer, shares an outlook on watches with me, and I've had the pleasure of owning each of his previous pieces. Previous Direnzos have recreated the curves of 1930s coach builders and the gauges facing Fangio during his seminal final laps of the Nürburgring in 1957. And so when I was told that Direnzo's third watch would be a dive watch, I was intrigued to see how a highly functional design would pair with the rather eccentric concept at the core of this brand, and I was, it does seem rather clear, not disappointed at all. Now the two watches I have here are both prototypes, and so as a consequence some elements may vary prior to final production, including the addition of a potential third colour. But I'm sure the brand will be very interested to hear what you have to say about these watches, as you can see them here in prototype form in the video. So do feel free to leave your comments throughout the video if there's anything you notice which is of interest in terms of something you like, or something which you don't. Before I begin, like, share and subscribe to catch all the latest here on the YouTube channel. Our podcast is now live on Spotify as well as SoundCloud, and will soon be live on iTunes too. Take a look at our Instagram page where we present regular photos and previews, and of course head over to watchchronicler.com for full articles and features, many of which are available only in written form. At first glance, the DRZ03 is an exercise in restraint by comparison to the madness of Direnzo's previous watches. Its silhouette is that of a 1950s or 60s diver, with a large crown, narrow bezel and very clear dial. It is however not long before the true intricacy begins to appear. The stainless steel case measures 40mm in diameter, a perfect size for most wrists, yet one which makes even more sense here. This is because it enables the bezel to be easily gripped by being 0.5mm wider, but more on that later. To match this ergonomic approach, the lug-to-lug measurement is 48mm, thus giving just enough presence to feel substantial, but without discomfort. The case thickness is similarly judged by being 12.5mm to the top of the crystal, but with an effective thickness well under 12mm. More noticeable is the screwed crown, which is unguarded but remains extremely detailed. Thanks to its shape, the toothed portion stands proud of the case whilst the edge sinks in, and this gives an easy grip whilst the top is rounded, signed and finely bead blasted so as to avoid snags. Where detailing is concerned across the rest of the watch, I really am spoiled as a reviewer. The watch is predominantly brushed with an exceptionally fine grain running around the case flanks and over the lug tops. The finish is cut by a crisp, polished bevel across the edge of these two surfaces, which also allows the bezel to sit apart and to be easily gripped. By contrast, the bezel ring is fitted with a retro-futuristic coin edge. As a consequence, it continues the style of the brand's former offerings, whilst placing an emphasis on practicality. This attention is noticeable even in the sharply cut rim of the bezel, which prevents it from catching unintentionally on clothes or edges. Of course, the dished sides and the alien aesthetics of the DRZ02 have been rather removed, but in their place are subtly flowing lugs, a marvellously designed crown, and a clear 120-click bezel. Less significant, but no less delightful on a watch which is, let's not forget, $499 on pre-order and ultimately $699, is the case back. This remains closed for reliable water resistance, but is decorated with graduations, as well as the specifications of the watch and the brand's logo, and is domed for comfort. Looking past this case back, we're given a very respectable Swiss movement in the form of the Sleater SW200. In light of increasing difficulty in sourcing ETA movements, it seemed that this Swiss-made automatic movement is a wise choice. With 26 joules, a 4Hz beat rate, hacking and hand winding, it's a very complete package for the money, and which should be serviceable for years to come, which is exactly what you need for a watch of this sort of price range, where you don't want to have an extremely elaborate or complicated movement to have serviced and maintained. Looking at the front of this watch more closely, we have a seemingly simple display. The sapphire crystal is double domed to minimise reflections and distortion, especially underwater, and of course this watch is a 200-metre water-resistant dive watch, so legibility has been considered very seriously. This is apparent in the bezel design, which gives as narrow an insert as possible, being only 3mm in width. This allows a very sensible level of legibility, but avoids robbing any sort of dial space. Sitting on the top of the bezel is a sapphire crystal under which colour is applied. The result is a more three-dimensional appearance than ceramic, and helps to echo the aquatic theme of this watch without compromising scratch resistance. An interesting aspect of note is the total lack of numerals or fine graduations which, on paper, are ISO standards for dive watches. However, the use of triangles, circles and battens avoids clutter and aside from lending beautiful symmetry, gives a clear focal point. It also echoes the line of the rare and stunning Breguet 1646 dive watch from the mid-1960s, reportedly only made in 60 examples. Whilst one could say that this is somewhat derivative, Direnzo has taken inspiration from an exceptionally elegant design and integrated it into something unique, thus making it really fine by me. Moving further into the centre, the dial is gently dished inwards thanks to a CNC process to aid legibility and to give another level of visual intrigue. The result is emphasised by a matte fumé surface which extends across this section of the dial. On this lower outer level are also applied the markers, a first for this brand. Here I really can't fault the quality even on a prototype, as the surfaces and planes are crisply polished and shapes contrast the bezel markings whilst matching at 12 o'clock. What's most satisfying to me is the repetition of shapes across the components, thus creating a unified design, but also one which works in terms of legibility and functionality, something which truly is important for a dive watch. The central portion of the dial is raised in a single matte colour with the finest of grey rims, thus lending the Eclipse part of this watch's name. However, as is so often the case, the details are the most eye-opening elements. The shrunken scale of the Direnzo and automatic 200-meter text and its grey colour gives a technical side to the look, whilst the use of red for the Direnzo logo adds a military touch to this design. The hands also play with the retro-futuristic feel of this watch, with the 1950s broad arrow form to the hour hand and a minute hand design reminiscent of FP Journe. As was the case with the DRZ02 when I reviewed it a little over a year ago, the hand proportions work extremely well with the dial construction. The second counterweight is just long enough to run along the hour hand rim, whilst it matches the width of the minute hand perfectly. Such attention extends to the minute hand length, which aligns exactly with its markers, and it's this kind of attention which keeps a watch like this interesting to wear. An aspect which may raise some debate is the choice of superluminova colour. The black or grey variant takes on a somewhat more vintage side, with an old radium tone with a green luminous colour, whilst the blue uses crisp white BGW9 which glows light blue. It should also be noted that the bezels are both fully luminous. Whilst I was expecting to enjoy the blue model more, the subtle tonality of the black variant is extremely enticing and lends a mid-century military feel to this watch. Once on the wrist, this watch takes on a new dimension. At first, the narrow bezel and exposed crown give the watch a smaller feel, which is aided by the balance of having the date, if chosen, at 6 o'clock. The crown doesn't dig into the wrist and the caseback sits low in order to make the watch rather slim. Perhaps due to the use of Tropic or Marine Nationale straps on these examples, the mind inevitably runs to military watches, thus preventing either colour variant from feeling too small or subtle. My only complaint with dimensions on the wrist is the flatness of the lugs. Whilst the lug-to-lug length is relatively modest at 48mm, the lugs extend just a little bit too far for wrists which are either more rounded or smaller than my 7-inch wrist. As a consequence, this may be worth tweaking before production to fit a wider audience. Otherwise the watch sits with comfort and stability on my wrist, and has been a pleasure to wear during the day. Where straps and bracelets are concerned, these watches will be available on an oyster-style bracelet and a Marine Nationale parachute cord strap. These will be joined by an optional Tropic strap for a less tactical look, and in the case of this video though, I simply have unmarked prototypes, but you can nonetheless get a rough idea of the aesthetic which this watch will have. As a watch then, the Direnzo DRZ03 Eclipse is a new direction for this brand. It represents something more adventurous than the DRZ250F, and more restrained than the DRZ02. However, it also shows the brand's commitment to the style of the 20th century, yet doesn't feel a need to imitate it. Instead, it brings back details with an unfalteringly light touch. Aside from the tweaks to the lug structure, my verdict is probably already clear, yet I'll add that I suspect that one of these might be finding their way into my collection very soon. And with that, remember to like, share and subscribe, and head over to watchchronicler.com for more. This is Armand from Watch Chronicler, out.